All right. Hey, folks, I'm Rob Carson. I'm the CEO of SemperSec. Thank you all for joining. Super excited to have you. So we're going to get started here with how to make CMMC 2.0 suck less using hyperproof Spurs module. So without further ado, I'm going to go quickly through the introductions here. We'll talk about a quick update, what's changed or what you need to know, how to prepare, and then ways that hyperproof makes it a little bit easier. Uh, Without further ado, though, I want to introduce Kane. So Kane McGladdery, please take it away, sir. Talk about yourself because we're honored to have you here.
Hey, thanks, Rob. Appreciate you having me. And I have for the audience who don't know me, that's a QR code if you need some super boring LinkedIn memes that involve regulatory change and law. Myself, I am a 30-year veteran of the cybersecurity industry, although we used to call it back in the day, we called it information security. Former A&D, that's Aerospace and Defense CISO, currently the field CISO at Hyperproof, and I am the author of the GRC maturity model, as well as senior member of the IEEE. Tom, you're cooler than I am. What do you do?
Good day, everybody. I'm Tom Regan. I'm the NIST lead consultant with SemperSec. Served 20 years in the Air Force doing communications and computers, and most recently spent 12 years in the federal government working for the Department of Veterans Affairs and also Department of the Interior doing cybersecurity and all things NIST. Rob?
Awesome. Well, let's get started here. So, hey, 2.0, it's coming. It's actually happening. So the requirements aren't new. They've been out since November 2021. The final rule, 32 CFR Part 170, formally established the CMMC program. We're still waiting for 48 CFR 204 to be finalized. Okay, so but it's really coming. We believe it's really happening. And the CMMC acquisition rule, when finalized, will allow the DoD to require specific CMMC level on solicitation and contracts. So that's what's happened. Essentially, like if you were part of the DFARS program, if you're doing defense industrial base, this isn't new. You still need to subscribe to 800-171. The difference really is going to be starting to actually have third-party certifications, things like that. That's what you need to know. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Kane here.
Yeah, and thanks, Rob. I want to start with the facts because CMMC's had a 5-year history, I'd say, of uncertainty about dates and times, or if it'd ever take effect. And like Rob said, if you went through DFARS about a decade ago, this is going to seem fairly similar because there was always the question of will they or won't they? And we finally know they will. So the CMMC clause rule is expected to take effect in mid to early 2025. And that's going to be the formal start of including cybersecurity maturity model certification, CMMC, requirements in Department of Defense contracts. And the implementation is going to start in 2 phases. Phase 1 is going to start on the effective date of the CMMC clause rule. So those two, the CMMC clause rule and phase 1, kick off on the same day, but they decided to separate them out because I'm not sure, actually. And at that point, we're going to have the Department of Defense incorporating level 1 and level 2 self-assessment requirements into relevant solicitations and contracts. Phase 2 is going to kick off about a year after the rule takes effect. So again, it's going to be my money's on mid-2026. And that phase is going to introduce some additional obligations, and that's specifically going to be third-party assessments for companies that are aiming to meet level 2 and level 3 standards. Rob?
All right. Absolutely. So, one second here. So that's let's talk about that level 2 assessment versus a C3 PAO. So plan on having a third party assessment. There is talk that 4%, 6% of the industry won't have to do it. They may be able to just do self attestation for level 2, but my money is on you being required to do it. And the reason why for that is essentially like, if how do I put this? If you're the person accepting the risk, are you really going to be the one to say, hey, no, it's cool, this doesn't involve national security? Because you might be surprised what actually does. So plan on doing it. They expect maybe let's say 6% of the industry may be able to just do self-attestation. It's unlikely you're going to be that 6%. So with that, let's go on here. Kane, let's pan it back to you, man.
Yeah, we talked about the when, and so I want to move us to talk about the who. And so CMMC2, and Rob, if you could just advance the slide, please. CMMC2 is going to primarily affect companies in the defense industrial base that handle federal contract information, which you're going to hear called FCI, and controlled unclassified information, which is either referred to as a CUI or as CUI. That includes defense contractors and subcontractors that store, process, or transmit sensitive information related to defense contracts. And the program is really designed to ensure that these companies maintain compliance with cybersecurity standards to protect that sensitive information from a variety of cyber threats. And here's the thing, these aren't new requirements. We've had these for a while. If you've signed a contract or if you signed contracts with either the DFARS 252, 204, 7019 or the DFARS 252, 204, 7020 clause, you've been expected to be compliant with these already, which means if you signed a contract 5 years ago, the DoD has the explicit understanding that you've been following your contractual obligations for the past 5 years. And so if there are any costs with doing that, you've already priced that into your contract and that you've already been you've been made whole by the DoD. That's the way they're looking at this. I'm not saying that that's reality, but that's their perspective of you signed a contract that says you were going to do some stuff and they assumed you were going to do it. Now, if you're still wondering at this point if you're affected, what you should go do is look at the documents that your prime or your sub has sent to you over the years. If they have a label on them that says FCI, but it doesn't say CUI, you're affected and you're going to be affected at level 1. So if you're only doing contracts, but you don't get any CUI, then you're probably level 1. If they're labeled with CUI, so maybe you're doing parts, but you aren't doing assemblies, then you're probably going to be affected at level 2, but that's a pretty generic statement. And you're going to have to work that out with your contracting officer, possibly with your prime, but there's more. That's just the first group of affected companies. And Rob, if you could just kick us on to the next slide, thanks.
Sure.
The DoD realized that supply chain risks exist in the world. I think somebody there might be reading the news. And so they extended CMMC 2.0 to include several additional types of company. And because they love some acronyms at the DoD, they introduced some new ones. So here goes. Cloud service providers, or CSPs, who are handling CUI, need to get and obtain and maintain FedRAMP moderate authorization, or it says comply with equivalent security standards. Now, I have no idea realistically what they're going to consider to be equivalent to FedRAMP moderate. True fact, I'm currently in a project to do FedRAMP moderate, which has led me and a good friend of mine to drink beer on YouTube. But that control really ensures that the necessary safeguards are in place when CUI is being stored or transmitted or processed in cloud-based environments. Next category is external service providers, or ESPs, that don't fall under that CSP category, but they still handle CUI. They don't need to have a CMMC certification, but their role and their services are going to be evaluated during the contractor's overall CMMC assessment, meaning that their security practices are still going to come under some scrutiny. When it comes to security protection data, or SPD, CSPs that manage SPD also need to get FedRAMP moderate authorization or meet an equivalent set of security requirements. Now, just as an aside here, what is an SPD, security protection data? The way to think about it this way is if you've got an MDR or an XDR or whatever we call this category of people who process your log files for you and then do stuff about it, and maybe under a continuous monitoring process. So, you used to have people looking at your SIM and now you've got somebody else looking at your SIM. That's security protection data as an example. So if you have somebody who's processing that for you, they need FedRAMP moderate. Now, if they get SPD, but they don't have access to your CUI, they're exempt from needing CMMC certification, but like before, they're going to have their services assessed as part of your overall compliance. Final category, CSPs and ESPs that don't do CUI or SPD, they're not subject to CMMC. But You still have to write them up. You have to document them in your system security plan, your SSP, which really makes sure that there's some transparency in the security measures that are being employed across the entire supply chain. So those are the basics. And if you've got more questions, we'll have time at the end. But I'll say this, neither Rob or Tom or I can tell you which CMMC level your company's going to need to attain without a pretty detailed conversation. I can point you to the DFARS Rule 252.204.7021, which is going to incorporate CMMC requirements into contracts and solicitations once it's finalized, but that's not yet finalized. And also, you could go read the 470-page CMMC rulemaking document. I will say there are some typos and errors in there, so you will find that to be a challenge. Finally, I'm going to say it's pretty unclear right now how the DoD is going to handle when they're ordering off a government-wide contract, like if they're buying off the GSA schedule program. And even though they've laid out the timing in the final rulemaking, it's really hard to know when certain opportunities are going to be moved to the DoD, sorry, to the CMMC program. I will say DoD has been pretty clear that there aren't going to be any Pathfinder programs this time, but that's not the point of the webinar. This is about SPURS scores. So let's move on now that we've established a context. Rob?
All right, let's talk about what to prepare for. So here's what's I think a lot of customers struggle with, and these are regardless of whether you're using a tool or not. These are things that people are going to run into challenges for, and what you need to be thinking about. So possible changes to application architecture. So Kane alluded to it earlier about do things need to be FedRAMP certified, right? So if you're handling CUI, if the way you read it, it says or equivalency, that could essentially mean you've got FedRAMP without a POAM, which would be even harder. So you have to be careful with that. That's going to be one of the challenges people are going to have in figuring out what's in scope. And I think that's one of the things that Kane, I think he did a great job of kind of talking about. Are they external service providers? Where are they? Where do they fit? So making sure that you don't boil the ocean and try to make everything awful. Just figure out what actually needs to be fixed. The other part is technical enforcement of the policy. You may have a lot of written. We see customers with a lot of aspirational policies when we start with them. If they already have a program in place, they're aspirational, but they're not actually technically enforced. And that can sometimes be a big change. So making sure that you're actually enforcing those policies. And then internal policy and procedures. So there's an Appendix E in one of the first versions, and then it's kind of modified a little bit, but there's a lot of implied tasks when you're talking about CMMC or any program that you gotta have policies and procedures, and they need to be accurate. Not just what you'd like them to be, but it's better to have them be what they actually are, also what they need to be to meet the requirement. But a lot of people have trouble getting that done. They a lot of analysis to paralysis, right? And then activity artifact generation. And this is where one of the things that's great about tools like Hyperproof is that it can be really good at collecting evidence, making sure you're following the processes, things like that, validating that your program is actually running on a regular basis. The other part is budget and top cover. So fun fact, nobody does this stuff for fun. So unless it's going to affect your ability to sell, no one's going to do it. So making sure that you've got the top management involved and they understand hey, if this is the industry we're going to be playing in, this is what we got to do to get it done. And again, analysis paralysis, that's where we're using a consultant firm like SemperSec, obviously I don't want to sound too self-serving, but find somebody to help you get through it and go, this is what you need to do this, do that, figure out what's going on. Also, be careful of working with consultants that have worked at programs that are, maybe the size of Boeing, right? If you're not the size of Boeing, you don't really necessarily want to work with the consultants worked at Boeing because they could build you a Boeing-sized program and it'd be awesome if you were that big and that's what you needed. But you're not that big. So maybe think about making sure you have a consultants worked at the size of industry you actually are. Okay.
Yeah, and I also think a lot of these challenges here are real, Rob. I remember a recent report that I saw that showed, I think it was 4% of contractors were fully prepared for CMMC certification. And the average score that was among the respondents to that survey was a -12, right? And we'll get to what SPURS scores are like, but you can guess that -12 might not be so good. And 15% of them had patch management solutions. Like that's a sort of basic IT that I think many of us assume exists in the world. I think 1 out of 5 had multi-factor authentication. Again, these feel like modern table stakes. And I think a quarter or 27% had endpoint detection response, which again, these feel like table stakes. But despite that, 75% of the respondents said that they were compliant through self-assessment, which means there's really a gap between what companies think they need to be doing and what they actually need to be doing.
Yeah, and that's a huge piece that I can't stress enough is bridging that gap. And hyperproof's going to help you to some degree, but I'll say this regardless, and I love hyperproof. Obviously, we do. No tool is going to replace you actually running your program. You have to run your program. The tool can only work as well as your program is functional and you have the right people making sure you're doing the things. It's kind of one of those, you can set up all these awesome alerts in hyperproof and have it do great things, but if people aren't answering the tickets, or if the tickets aren't being sent to, if you aren't using the two-way connection where it sends it to their to Jira or to ServiceNow or to whatever ticketing system that your IT group uses, it doesn't matter. So making sure your program actually makes sense and can be functional. And I think that's where I think a lot of people fall down is they either believe magical software is just going to solve all their problems, or they don't necessarily have someone to help guide that path. And I'm gonna go to the next slide here. Coverage. So this is a big piece. And I have this here more or less so that you can understand that if you have an ISO program, awesome. You have some controls that directly map. The difference though is that as Kenny was talking about with the score earlier, you don't get partial credit, so it's all or nothing. So do you have multi-factor authentication enabled for all of the different systems that are in scope for your CUI processing? Making sure that you actually have figured that piece out, right? So the difference, whereas ISO might let you decide it's more risk-based, so some things matter less, some things matter more, versus NIST 80171 or CMMC is going to basically go, hey, is this real? If it's in scope, this is what needs to be. No ifs, ands, or buts, right? A partial implementation is not going to get you very far. So making sure you understand, like, there is overlap, and that's great. It can totally help you out. And those of you who think, well, I'm going to do NIST 80171, and this will prepare me for FedRAMP. No, that's nice, and it sounds great, and it will get you further down the path, absolutely. But it is not the same thing. FedRAMP is not called FunRAMP, and it's a different beast, all into its own. So be careful if you think it's a bridge. It is a bridge, but it's kind of like moving from flag football to maybe varsity high school football, but varsity high school football is not the same as SEC football. So you still have a bigger jump to go, but you are further down the path for sure. All right, Kane, I'll turn it back over to you here.
Yeah, Rob, you said SEC football, and immediately all I was thinking is like Gary Gensler and Eric Girding playing football, right? I don't think I think there are some people who would enjoy certainly tackling them. But I want to go to the CMMC, just a refresher on what are these levels, because that'll help understand what are the requirements and what are the SPURS scores that are required to actually achieve them. So CMMC level 1, starting at the bottom of the slide there, that's the foundational level, and it's intended for those contractors that handle federal contract information, that FCI that we mentioned earlier. And it focuses on basic security controls to safeguard that FCI. And it requires contractors to follow 17, I'd say they're pretty basic cybersecurity practices that are derived from the Federal Acquisition Clause 52-204-21. And those controls are some really fundamental protections to make sure that FCI contracts are appropriately secured. So contractors who need a level 1 certification they have to do a self-assessment of their cybersecurity practices. That self-assessment needs to be attested to annually by an affirming official within the organization, confirming that the necessary controls are in place. After they complete the self-assessment, the contractor is going to send that self-assessment, that attestation, to the Department of Defense through the SPURS system. And those compliance requirements at level 1, they're pretty straightforward. And in most cases, I'm pretty sure you could just use a questionnaire to prove compliance. So if you find yourself thinking, hey, I need level 1, I don't need level 2, can hyperproof help you with that? Sure. Do you need the SPURS module? Do you need to go to that level? Probably not. But most folks are going to be in level 2. Level 2 is the advanced level, and it's designed for contractors that are managing controlled unclassified information. And I'd say it's more comprehensive compared to level 1. Level 2 involves 110 cybersecurity practices, which are aligned with the standards in NIST 800-171, and specifically 800-171, and its appendix, or its addendum 171A. And to get really specific and granular here, it's Rev 2, not Rev 3, because reasons that we'll get to later, right? For now, just know that it's Rev 2. But those practices focus on expanding and extending protection to CUI, which is beyond what's in the level 1. Now, contractors can get compliance through 2 assessment options. Either they can go through an annual self-assessment or undergo a certification assessment by a CMMC third-party assessment organization, a 3PAO, every 3 years. And the assessment method is going to depend based on contract-specific requirements. Once a self-assessment is complete, contractors or their 3PAO, again, are going to send that up to the Department of Defense. And if a contractor has unmet controls, they can document how they're going to address those using a plan of action and milestones, or a POAM. That's going to seem familiar to some of you, but POAMs can't be used for controls with a point value greater than 1, and all the actions have to be done within 180 days, so there's no longer a revolving door of POAMs. Finally, CMMC level 3, if you are at Boeing, if you are at Raytheon, if you make assemblies, you probably know what that means. You are going to be at the expert level, which means you have particularly sensitive CUI. And it's got enhanced cybersecurity requirements that really are meant to address threats from APT groups or sophisticated criminal groups. It builds on the 110 controls in level 2 by adding 24 more practices from NIST 800-172. Unlike level 2, you can't do a self-assessment. You can't use a 3PAO to get a level 3 assessment. They're going to be done exclusively by the Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Assessment Center, known as DIBCAC, or DIBI to their friends. And contractors have to maintain that formal assessment every 3 years to keep their certification up. Now, the DoD is going to figure out level 3 applicability again on a contract by contract basis. Everything I've read, they think it's going to be about 1% of contractors. So if you're a prime, you're probably on there. If you're a sub, it gets really questionable really quickly. Contractors can still use POAMs to address any gaps in compliance, but again, there is not that revolving door. You have to fix things within 180 days. And to get certified at level 3, you have to have a perfect score on all your level 2 controls and score at least 20 out of 24 on your level 3 controls. Rob?
All right. I want to encourage more people. Michael just sent in a question, and feel free to send more. We're going to get to them at the end here. But if you have questions along the way, please shoot them in the Q&A, and we will get to it at the end. Sorry, just want to make sure I cover that. So we were looking for memes. I love memes. This is an important meme, I think. This is how your controls documenting your policy. It make it look perfect, tidy, and beautiful. But let's be honest, this is what it looks like in reality, right? So when you're writing there's a lot more than people think when you're writing your SSP, and it's far more detailed than people realize, and that's the part that I think for a lot of companies, they're like, oh, it's 110. It's like, well, there's actually 320 objectives that we have to go through to get to that 110 requirement. So the requirement isn't just one thing. It's, do this, but it's like, show me your policy that says you do this. Okay, now show me that you actually follow that through, like all those different pieces, it's probably going to be a little bit more than people think. But with that, we're going to turn it over to our other panelists. And actually, Kane, you got one more slide here, and we're gonna
Just want to
Thomas.
cover down on what SPURS is. I think many folks have probably seen it before, but in case you've wondered it and you're new, the Supplier Performance Risk System, that's SPURS, really provides a central repository for supplier and product performance assessments by the DoD, and it allows them to identify and evaluate and monitor the performance of the contractor base, and that's defined in DoD 5079. Now, your SPURS score and all materials, those are actually reported through the Procurement Integrated Enterprise Environment, the PIEE. I wish somebody here had a bingo card just for the number of acronyms that we're using, but that's where you put your SPURS score in. So you don't just get your SPURS score out of hyperproof, job done. You actually have to go into the PIEE, which is something that DoD makes, which would actually be where you'd submit. Now, SPURS score is derived from the results of your system security plan, the SSP. The SSP really defines the security controls that you've implemented to safeguard FCI and CUI, and those have to be documented. So again, if you don't have an SSP, you really can't submit your SPURS score, although I do know tales of organizations that have done just that. Tom, let's go over to you to talk about what Hyperproof can do.
All right, thanks, Kane. So first, some quick background on SPURS in Hyperproof. The feature was added this past May, and it only applies to two specific frameworks for 800-171, and as Kane had mentioned, it is Rev 2. We're going to foot stomp this for the remainder of the presentation, and you'll see why. And then it also applies to CMMC 2.0. Now, the scores are calculated based on implementing the requirements as shown. So the 110 requirements that show up for 800-171 Rev 2 match those one for one. And this is why the distinction is important between 171 Rev 2 and Rev 3 is because Rev 3, as you may have seen, drops down to 97 requirements. So the numbers are different. And when we show you the module, it's going to make a lot more sense. For CMMC level 1, there are 70 requirements that match the 15 practices or the 17 practices that you see in CMMC. For CMMC level 2, there are 230 requirements that are going to show up in Hyperproof, but it's matching the 110 practices for level 2, which correlates directly to 171 Rev 2. And then there are 120 additional requirements that show up, and these are primarily NFO controls for non-federal organizations. And per NIST, these are expected to be routinely satisfied without any other specification. There's also some additional DFARS requirements that are in there. But just know to generate your SPURS score, it's going to be based on those 110 requirements only. Now, when you get into Hyperproof, or before you get into Hyperproof, you can generate a SPURS score by using their data evaluation criteria because it's just the sum of some risk factors. No big deal, right? But there's 10 different risk factors. They all have their own formula. They all have their own weighting. So unless you want to become the next math meme, just let Hyperproof do it for you. The important takeaway here is that the SPURS scoring and CMMC are based on 171 Rev 2, but those are both founded and mapped to 853 Rev 5. So they're beginning to update the guidelines, and they're updating these standards, if you will, but it's going to take some time. So 171 Rev 3 will map to CMC in future rulemaking once they've finished with the 48 CFR, and then they're on to bigger and better things. So there's going to be some work that needs to be done, and this is where we come in as implementers of these programs, is because we need to make this translation based on customer requirements. So here's what it looks like in Hyperproof. The comparison that we have are two current programs, and the one on the left is actually 800/171 Rev 3. But remember, the SPURS module is only active for 171 Rev 2 and CMMC, not 171 Rev 3 yet. The scoring module will be updated whenever DoD indicates that they're making the move to Rev 3. But honestly, it's going to be a while. I mean, DoD is giving contracting officers the ability to assess under Rev 2 for well into next year. It's like 18 months from the publication of Rev 3. So we're just going to have to wait for this rulemaking to finish completely, and then we'll see what guidance we get after that. So left is non-SPURS implemented program. On the right is 800/171 Rev 2, of course. See, on the dashboard, you see the SPURS module there in the middle, highlighted, and there's three primary sections. So the score, and yes, as Kane mentioned, you can have a negative score, but everybody's got to start somewhere, and it's because of the weighting is how you get a negative score. The requirements implementation status is shown as a percentage in the middle. And then you have the weighted status that's on the right. And you may notice that there's one requirement that is unweighted, and that is 3.12.4, which is to develop, document, and update a system security plan. And that is a go or no-go requirement. No SSP equals no SPURS score and no self-attestation. So we'll see how the requirements progress as you meet them, and we'll see what the percentage looks like. Kane?
Yeah, and as you'll see, completing or implementing requirements really does improve your score. And in the weighted status, the green portion of the bar is going to be a continuing visual indication, but there's not really a pass or fail here. And it's pretty unclear where contracting officials are going to set the bar for contracts. Now, I am going to go out on a limb here and guess that a government official is not going to risk their career on a contractor with a score of a negative 100. That's speculation, admittedly. But I also don't think that they're going to shut down for business and going to say that everybody needs a score of 110 to win contracts either. I'd say that your SPURS score is going to be evaluated, and I hope that the contracting official is going to make a risk-based informed decision whether or not the SPURS score should be a positive or negative number, not that there's going to be some black and white rule. And I'm sorry for many of us who have worked in this space before, black and white rules sure would be helpful. We're still working with a lot of the fog of war, a lot of the gray here right now. Back to you, Tom.
Thank you. So we keep mentioning the importance of the SSP in addition to the actual SPURS score, because again, for self-attestation, you must submit the SSP. It is not simply just inputting the score. So as you are working on your SSP, the document, Hyperproof can generate what they call an SSP implementation details report, and you can use that for input to whatever SSP template you choose. And we'll show you this a little bit in our client example coming up. But within the program, you just simply go up to the ellipses, hit generate work report, and then the SSP implementation details report. Now, if you are a user of Hyperproof now, but maybe new to CMMC or the SPURS module, the ellipses actually show something different. They show a security control plan, and it's basically the same with your implementation details. It just doesn't include the assessment objectives, but I'll show you why those are a great feature later. So here's a direct example of one of our client engagements. For company X, we were tasked simply to improve our SPURS score. That's it. So we conducted an initial assessment using a spreadsheet template, which you can see a portion of that at the top, but there was no SPURS score because they didn't have an SSP. And this template actually said that it's requirement or control 3.12.4. So even though they had over half of the requirements implemented, you're basically getting a big old not applicable because you don't have an SSP, you don't get a score. But we took these self-assessment results and put them into hyperproof. And actually, company X would have ended up with around a 9. And it's like, hey, 9 isn't super great, but it's not negative, right? So obviously their score would have been a little bit higher if they would have had the SSP and other requirements built in. So all we did was just work on it for them. And if you notice on the bottom right in the weighted status, that unweighted disappeared. Well, this was a first version of the module, and it was updated after the initial release. So we just used the tool to our advantage, and we started working on filling out implementation details for incomplete requirements. And the score was creeping up from what would have been a baseline of a 9, and we were into the upper 40s. And since we were just tasked to improve their score, it was really up to our client as what is what is good enough for you? What is improvement enough for you? And when do you want to report that? So we also looked at the requirements weighting and used that to our advantage to get a few quick wins. And before they submitted their score in the PIEE portal, it's, what can we do to bump that up just a little bit more? And, obviously there's going to be a cut line, right? If you want to report when you want to report, but what else can we do? So one of the things we looked at, and an example is the requirement for a POAM document. The company didn't have one. So that's weighted as a 3. And all we needed to do was create a template, publish that template, make it a part of their document library, and that's what they would use for their plans of action and milestones. And once we had implemented that, that bumped up the score with really about 10 to 15 minutes effort. So as you see on the screen, yeah, 52 is what we decided, but 52 is a lot better than NA. So that was submitted and mission complete. Now, the SSP template that you use is your choice. There is a CUI template out there if you go back to 171 Rev 2 that NIST provides, but they're not planning an equivalent for Rev 3, nor do they need to. There's no prescribed format per NIST. You need to meet the requirements of 3.12.4, which is to develop, document, and update an SSP. So let's look at what the SSP looks like when we fill out the implementation details. So again, we use that CUI SSP template for our client, which was really just a lot of hand jamming of the implementation details that we ended up putting into the tool. And then, of course, figuring out how to check a non-checkbox in Microsoft Word. So if you are super skilled at that, then go for it freestyle, or as shown on the right, why not let Hyperproof simplify the process for you and just copy and paste from that export that's generated by the tool into your template. And then boom, you've completed about 95% of your SSP with that portion. One thing to note in the Hyperproof export is the inclusion of the assessment objectives in the implementation details. This is really a great feature because you can demonstrate to your system owners and to your external assessors exactly how you provided implementation details to meet specific requirements in a very detailed fashion. So super easy, super effective. But this is what Hyperproof can do for you. Kane?
Thanks, Tom. So we're kind of coming towards the point where we'll have time for questions as we begin to wrap up with the conclusion slide. We provided some background on the CMMC and also some familiarity with the SPURS module in Hyperproof. We also looked at the self-attestation requirements, both how to calculate your score and, as Tom said, to generate your SSP. Moving forward, I'd really recommend that you use the requirements weighting to prioritize the requirements that you haven't implemented yet, because that'll really improve your SPURS score. So take down the big numbers before you take the small numbers. And I'd also use the SSP details within Hyperproof to produce that implementation detail report, which is going to make life easy for template completion. With that, I think we have about 15 minutes left for Q&A. Rob, you want to lead us off with that?
Yeah, let's do it. So first question, does CMMC affect contractors that work with DHA on on-prem DoD systems that already go through RMF ATO process? So I think what they're talking about is contractors maybe already fall under FSMA. But Thomas, I'll turn that over to you. Maybe you want to take that one?
Yeah, it's hard to give a specific answer, but I'll give you an illustration from like working with Department of the Interior. Uh, we had contracts, we had contractors building our systems, administering our systems, but they were considered the government because they were working on it. I would say if you had contractors that were developing or storing that CUI separately, that's
Yep.
when CMMC rules are going to apply to you, and those would be specified in your contract.
And I would say to the person who asked that, if you want to have a private conversation offline, we're happy to have an NDA and discuss that in further detail to understand your contracts. But there's really the difference is the data going back to your systems, or is the data staying on the government systems? But it doesn't mean you don't still have to follow FSMA rules and things like that. The difference is a lot of that stuff is handled through the ATO process. So good question. And then another question here is, I heard that there's a requirement of meeting at least 80% of controls before submitting a SPURS score, and that anything under 110 must be accompanied by an acceptable POEM. Is this not expected to remain the case?
I kind of
So
want to pick that one apart, but also I want to
yeah,
hear Tom on this one as well as you, Rob. So I've been on going to the CMMC town hall meetings for a while now. They are sometimes informative, and sometimes we get conflicting information from them. I think there's actually a lot of conflicting information, especially if you look at the long legacy of CMMC. So what I'd say right now, should you have a POAM if you have a score of less than 110? Yes, you should also have an SSP, because otherwise you really won't be able to move forward. But I don't think that there's going to be some easy black and white, it has to be 80% of your controls. We do know that you want to have your big numbers down, like anything that's a control value of 3, for example, knock those down. I think that if you have all of your ones open, you're not going to have the most amazing score, but you're probably doing okay. But I do think it's going to be still, at least at first, it's going to be a risk determination by your contracting officer, or alternatively by your prime or by your sub, because otherwise the alternative is business shuts down. The DoD, if they were to say everybody needs 110, well, they can buy from 3 people or from 4 companies, probably, right? I think that would be an unacceptable risk to the ongoing mission of the DoD. And so they have to make some calculations on their side to say, what is an acceptable risk?
mhm. I think it's going to be also, I would add where you're missing your scores. Like if you haven't done your instant response test versus you don't have multi-factor authentication, they might care more about multi-factor authentication, but it also depends on what do you do, right? Uh, you know, are you guarding nuclear codes, or are you just selling teddy bears that they hand out to the Peace Corps? I don't know, right? Um, Thomas, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with both of you on those fronts. I think there's got to be context to it as well. If you are self-attesting and reporting your score for CMMC level 1, you have to meet all of those requirements. um, you don't have a choice. You cannot have a POAM document. And this is what Kane was talking about, where, yeah, there's a lot of confusion between sitting in on various forums. And honestly, what was published by the DoD previously, and then all of that information changed and was tidied up after the rulemaking. But to me, with the 32 CFR, the rulemaking being published, it did clarify that more. I mean, at least for me, I saw that. Level 1, you don't get a POAM document. Level 2, you have a POAM document, but you're going to have to resolve that within 180 days. Like Kane said, it's not a revolving door. Just keep it open forever and ever.
Yeah, and just to give two final examples on this one, I can think of two prior clients that I used to advise. I used to do executive advisory work. And one of them made bootlaces, and the other one did fire suppression systems. And I think they're both really good illustrative examples. So the one that made bootlaces, you think what information can an adversary get about an infantry, somebody who's in the inventory about their bootlaces? Probably not going to be a level 2 prioritized, or it's not going to require you to get a 3PAO. However, this bootlace manufacturer, literally, we're just talking bootlaces, whatever they're made out of, fabric, leather, string, stuff, I'm sure, maybe metal. They worked with a prime of theirs, or a sub to their prime, that put those bootlaces into boots. And those boots got interesting really quickly, because it turns out modern infantry boots have sensors in them that are probably IoT sensors that probably collect a lot of interesting telemetry, which would be of interest. So then the conversation goes, okay, is that boot manufacturer who puts the telemetry modules into the boots going to pass down or flow through any CUI requirements associated with the fact that those bootlaces, and this is where there has to be a discussion. It's not yes or no, it's not right or wrong, it's is that sub or that prime who's making the boots going to manage their risks by saying, well, we have to do 3PAO assessments, so you do too, even though you literally just make bootlaces. The other example that I'll give briefly, a client of mine was doing fire suppression systems, and that's, you think overhead sprinklers and that sort of thing. And they thought that, hey, there's no possible way this is CUI. It's not labeled as CUI. It's not marked as CUI. They just get schematics of military bases, right? Like where all the fire, and sure, it doesn't say like, here is the room with all the good stuff, and here's the room with all the neat computers, but it sure does show a really good detailed schematic of where the fire suppression is. And you can kind of figure out by the fire suppression system what is in the room. I'd say they'd be lucky if they're only level 2 CUI, for a CMMC assessment and going to have to do a 3PAO. They might go into that spooky level 3 because of the type of data that they're actually processing. And it's not like you can just have a schematic of pipes and not know that there's walls associated with those pipes. Again, though, this is going to be where there's going to be a lot of negotiation and contracting that will determine probably what will be the final acceptable determination of a given contractual vehicle.
Absolutely. Hey, I want to give an opportunity. Any last minute questions? Anybody want to raise their hand? Anything else they got? Looks like we're done here. With that being said, first I want to take time to make sure, Kane, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you and Hyperproof support with everything that SemperSec does. And Thomas, always like you're the NIST ninja and the Hyperproof NIST ninja for us, and we're grateful for you joining as well. So thank you all for attending. And if you have questions in the future, please, you know how to reach out to us. You can get me at rob.carson@sempersec.com. Kane's got his stuff. This will be attached in the on the website, as well as we'll put this contact information below. So thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, take care, everyone.